Hi everybody and welcome to my channel. In this episode I'm going to be talking about the largest sentence ever handed out in Scotland. And the reason why I'm talking about this in this episode is because I've covered cases in England and Wales where prisoners are serving life without parole. So I looked up into Scotland to see in the Scottish prison system to see if there was any prisoners serving life without parole. But I didn't realise that up in Scotland they don't have a sentence where it's life without parole. When prisoners get sentenced to life up in Scotland, they have to set a minimum term, and this is by law. So when I looked into this, and a serial killer popped up by the name of Angus Sinclair. Now, I'm sure some of the Scottish subscribers will be familiar with this name, but I've never actually heard of him before and never come across it. So what I've done is put a few bits together on my laptop just so I can get the facts right. Some of it's off Wikipedia, some of it's off the BBC News, and some off Murderpedia. And I've put it all together just so I can tell you the straight facts, because it's all good and well reading up on it and then talking about it, but you will miss vital parts out. So Angus Sinclair was actually sentenced to life imprisonment with a recommendation of 37 years, meaning he would have been 106 when he was up for parole. So technically it is, because of his age, more or less might as well say life without parole, even though he could have gotten paroled, but he's not. Well, he didn't actually live that long. He died in 2019, only 5 years after getting convicted on the World's End murders. So Angus Sinclair is a serial killer and rapist, and he was jailed for 37 years for the murders of 2 teenage girls. Sinclair raped and strangled 17-year-olds Helen Scott and Christine Eady after a night out at the World's End pub in Edinburgh's Royal Mile in 1977. He was 69 at the time when he went on trial for these murders, because it went unsolved for 37 years. So the 69-year-old at the time was the first person in Scotland to be retried for the same crime after an acquittal following a change in the double jeopardy law. So he'd already been up on trial for this case and he got acquitted on it because there wasn't enough evidence. So when he's went back up a second time, because normally when it mentions the double jeopardy law, which means if you go on trial for something and you're found not guilty or either acquitted, they can't retry you. But they changed the law for people like this, who they knew were guilty, but they just didn't have enough evidence. So police believed he also killed at least 6 other women and girls. The 37-year sentence, which comes 37 years after Sinclair murdered the 2 teenagers, is the longest ever handed out by a Scottish court and means that the killer would be aged 106 before he could apply for parole. So I'm just going to go into a little bit about his background of offending. So his full name is Angus Robertson Sinclair. In 1959, he stole an offertory box from a Glasgow church, aged 13. In the same year, he was charged with housebreaking. And in 1961, he committed lewd and libidinous practices on an 8-year-old girl, sentenced to 3 years probation. In 1961, he was convicted of killing Catherine Rehill, aged 7, sentenced to 10 years in prison and served only 6 years. Now, when I was looking up into this case, because like I've said, I've done a bit of research into it, and what struck me was, how can somebody who has been convicted of murdering a 7-year-old girl, sentenced to 10 years, and he only served 6 years? Now, to me, this is a massive letdown by the Scottish justice system, because anyone that kills a child should never be released from prison, let alone freed, after serving only 6 years. and left to go unnoticed to go on to commit even more murders and heinous crimes. So in 1970, not long after he was released, he marries trainee nurse Sarah Hamilton and has a son 2 years later. In 1977, thought to have murdered 6 women within 7 months, Frances Barker, 37, Hilda McCauley, 36, Agnes Cooney, 23, and Anna Kenny, 20, all from Glasgow, and Christine Eady and Helen Scott from Edinburgh. In 1978, murdered 17-year-old Mary Gallagher in Glasgow. And in 1980, he was charged with an illegal possession of a .22 caliber revolver. In 1982, he pleaded guilty to rape and sexual assault of 11 children aged 6 to 14, sentenced to life in prison. But so he's been in prison since 1982, but how could he have went unnoticed for all these crimes he went on to commit after he was already convicted of killing a child? And who on earth would go on to marry somebody like this if they knew his background? In 2000, the Cold Case Review of 1978, Mary Gallagher murder. In 2001, he was convicted of the murder of Mary Gallagher. In 2007, the trials for the murders of Christine Eady and Helen Scott collapses. So it's took another 7 years. So it was 2014, 7 years after the first trial collapses. He had the retrial, and the retrial finds Sinclair guilty of the World's End murders. And for that, he received 37 years, a life sentence without possibility of parole for 37 years. Sinclair raped and killed Christine Eady and Helen Scott, both 17, in 1977. The sentence means 69. He was 69-year-old when he eventually got found guilty of these murders. And he was a dangerous predator, will die behind bars. So what I'm going to do is go into details, not too much detail, but details of the World's End murders and how it all happened. So serial killer and paedophile Angus Sinclair has been jailed for life for the murder and rape of 2 17-year-olds in 1977. Sinclair brutally killed Christine Eady and Helen Scott, who were both 17, after a night out at Edinburgh's World End pub 37 years ago. Their bodies were found the following day in East Lothian. They had been bound and throttled with their underwear. Sinclair had previously murdered at least 2 other women, was accused of carrying out the attacks with his brother-in-law, Gordon Hamilton, who died in 1996 before he could face justice. Sinclair was sentenced to life in prison at a trial at the High Court in Livingston and would spend 37 years behind bars. Sentencing Judge Lord Matthews told Sinclair he was a dangerous predator who was capable of sinking to the depths of depravity. The prosecution is the first under changes to Scotland's double jeopardy law, which meant he could be retried for the murders after a previous retrial collapsed 7 years apart. The jury of 9 women and 6 men took less than 2.5 hours to convict Sinclair unanimously of both charges. Police fear Sinclair, who has been in prison for more than 30 years, killed at least 6 women and girls, as well as the 2 17-year-olds. Miss Eady and Miss Scott got into Sinclair's camper van after a night drinking in the city centre pub. Their bodies were found 6 miles apart in East Lothian countryside less than 24 hours later. Miss Eady was found naked on Gosford Bay, and Miss Scott was discovered on a farm, exposed from the waist down. Lord Matthews said that whatever dreams the girls had for their futures had turned to nightmares that night when they left the World's End pub. Sentencing Sinclair, he said, little were they to know that they had the misfortune to be in the company of 2 men for whom the words evil and monster seem inadequate. Unless one day your conscience, if you have one, motivates you to tell the truth, no one other than you will ever know precisely what part you and Gordon Hamilton played in these awful events. Perhaps it does not matter. What does matter is that the girls were subjected to an ordeal beyond comprehension, and then left like carrion, exposed for all to see, with no dignity even in death. For them at least the nightmare is over, and if they were not resting in peace today, I hope that they are now. The nightmare for the families and friends, on the other hand, had gone on from those first awful moments when they heard the news no one should hear, until now, 37 years later and counting. It will never end. No one who saw the evidence of Helen's father, sisters and boyfriend and Christine's mother could fail to have been moved by it. They are an example to us all, waiting patiently for justice while the authorities have worked tirelessly to achieve it. The judge added the evidence in this case, as well as your record, details of which have now been revealed, shows that you are a dangerous predator who was capable of sinking to the depths of depravity. I do not intend to waste many words on you. You are well aware that the only sentence I can pass is one of life imprisonment. The judge then recited the poem for the fallen, usually reserved for paying tributes to soldiers on Remembrance Day. Speaking of the girls, he said, they shall grow not old as we that are left to grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning we will remember them. I say that because while all of their loved ones would have wished to see them live on, to ripe old age, the memories they will have of them will always be of happy, home, loving, innocent girls by the ravages of time. That is indeed how I think the whole country will remember them. Miss Edie and Miss Scott had been enjoying drinks with friends at the busy Edinburgh pub on a Saturday night. The girls were invited to a party but decided to head home because Miss Scott was tired. However, as they went to leave, they began chatting to two men, Sinclair and Hamilton. The conversation did not last longer than 25 minutes and the pair were seen outside the pub at closing time. Sinclair is the only living person who knows what happened next. The beginning of what was one of Scotland's largest ever murder investigations began. So for 37 years he got away with these murders, but it wasn't until advances in forensic science brought Angus Sinclair to justice. The two girls were discarded with such casual contempt that surely they must have held an abundance of clues. These were not so much careful, calculating killers as shameless savages who exhibit the extent of their depravity in the state in which they left their victims. Christine Edie was found on her back, her wrist bound with one leg of her tights. The other leg had been used to strangle her. Her pants were stuffed into her mouth and her bra was around her head, holding the gag in place. She had been beaten, bitten and raped. Helen was found hours later face down, naked below the waist, her coat belt binding her hands and Christine's belt around her neck. There was a stamp mark on the side of her head with a tread pattern that matched a footprint at the site where Christine was found. She had been raped too, and may well have watched her friend die before the killers turned on her. They were brazen, sexually motivated murders which cried out for justice, and yet for almost 40 years none came. In the 1970s, forensic science was a much blunter instrument in crime detection than it is today. DNA profiling would not be known for a decade or more, but there was still plenty to be gleaned from old-fashioned police work. Eyewitness accounts for one. The World's End pub had been packed when Christine and Helen arrived with their friends Tony Whale and Jacqueline Ingalls shortly before 10 p.m. on October the 15th, 1977. Someone inside must have seen the girls after Tony and Jacqueline last seen them. It turned out quite a few had, but even in those early days of the murder inquiry, a streak of cruel luck was hampering it. Virtual doppelgangers for Christine and Helen had been in the pub just before they arrived. Many of those who gave information had seen the wrong girls. Those who really had seen Christine and Helen told two men had been in their company. The stockier one wore trousers and distinctive patches at each pocket. His friend had a thick, dark moustache. Policeman John Rafferty came closest to witnessing the tragedy unfold. As the pub closed, the 50-year-old officer had seen Christine fall and had helped her to her feet. He then became aware of a man staring at him close to the door of the pub. He stepped forward and offered the girls a lift to wherever they wanted to go. The policeman next saw the girls heading down St. Mary's Street with the same man and another For years, speculation would run riot about the identity of these two men, who were the killers. The truth would finally come from the unlikeliest of sources, Sinclair himself, when he made the unwise choice to take the stand and confirm that he and his brother-in-law Gordon Hamilton had spirited the girls away that night. Back in 1977, detectives spent a great deal of time trying to track those men down. The manpower Lothian and Border Police threw into the murder case was unprecedented. At its height, 60 officers were working full-time on the case. They chased up numerous leads, many of which turned out to be entirely false. One witness in the pub thought one of the two men seen with the girls mentioned an army background, and one of them had unfashionably short haircut. As a result, every squatty in Scotland was spoken to. Underworld figures such as Glasgow crime boss Arthur Thompson and his son Arthur Jr. were also interviewed, but that was only because their enemies had passed false information to the police just to accuse the Thompsons. There was precious little in the way of clues which might have pointed Sinclair's way, but one was a sighting of a van outside the World's End pub, and a similar one parked outside a phone box in the East Lothian village of Drem, 3 miles from where Helen's body was found in a field. Sinclair had a Toyota Hiace camper van. Could this have been the vehicle that was seen? Then there were the knots in the ligatures. Those binding Christine were reef knots indicative of a killer with a knowledge of knot tying. As it happened, Sinclair had made fishing nets during his first spell in prison. A more rudimentary granny knot had been used to bind Helen, which suggested 2 men were involved. There were other reasons to suspect 2 killers. 2 would be able to control a couple of teenagers, possibly fighting for their lives, which more easily than 1. By spring 1978, the investigation was running out of steam. Mountains of files, statements, tip-offs, and eyewitnesses' accounts seemed to point nowhere in particular. Effectively, the case remained in cold storage for a decade. Significantly, however, all the girls' clothes were scrupulously preserved. This, police said today, was testament to the determination of everyone involved with the case to ensure whoever was responsible for such a horrifying crime would be caught. It was as if they somehow knew that one day science would have much more to say about the evidential material stored in the police archives. In 1988, a prisoner at Edinburgh's Soughton jail claimed he had heard 2 inmates talking about the murders in a way that suggested inside knowledge. Archie Motion and Colin Coyne were each interviewed but turned out to have alibis for the time of the murders. The episode did not prompt a fresh look at the case, however, and a very basic DNA profile from a semen stain on Helen's coat was extracted, but no match was found. By 1996, huge advances in DNA profile allowed a 12-band profile to be extracted from the same stain and for this to be checked against the new national DNA database set up the previous year. But again, there were no matches. Police therefore tried a different approach. They began a process of intelligence-led DNA swabbing involving hundreds of potential suspects who were not on the database. Those approached for swabs were promised their DNA profiles would be checked for this case only and then destroyed. In order to rule themselves out, the vast majority were happy to comply. It was a massive exercise which took several years but ultimately came to the naught because the DNA profile police held belonged to a man who was not on the database. Gordon Hamilton had died in 1996, and it was simply bad luck they had not managed to extract Sinclair's DNA. But their luck was about to change in 2000 during another cold case review. Forensic scientists Lester Knibb untied the knots on the tights used to strangle the girls. From the material which had been inside the knots, a soup of DNA belonging to more than one person was recovered. Nothing of use could be extracted from it at the time, but this area of science was moving very quickly. In time, DNA profiles corresponding with both girls and both killers would be found in the knots. In the meantime, a new DNA process involving the comparison of Y chromosomes which are passed down the male line was coming on stream. A previously untouched section of staining on Helen's coat yielded 2 DNA profiles, a dominant one and an underlying one. A police source said the dominant one gave sufficient material to do a low copy profile, and we got a completely different DNA profile coming up. We ran it on the DNA database and it came back as Angus Robert Sinclair. I knew of him. He was in jail for murder. At long last, police had a name. Not only did his DNA profile fit, his criminal profile fitted too. Any officer explaining his record would have had no difficulty in believing the Glasgow-born monster was capable of committing the world-end murders. But whose was the mystery DNA? A thorough trawl of Sinclair's past associates threw up the answer. Hamilton had entered Sinclair's orbit when he came to stay with his sister, Sarah Hamilton, in Glasgow. Sinclair, a painter and decorator, was her husband. In the summer of 1977, the two men planned a series of weekend trips in Sinclair's van. They were supposedly fishing trips, but there was no evidence of fish having been caught when they returned home. What were they really doing on these trips? Hamilton, dead for 10 years, was in no position to tell detectives, and Sinclair, in prison since 1982, was not of a mind to do so. Ultimately, a search of the flat in Glasgow's Denniston would provide the DNA match that proved Hamilton was Sinclair's accomplice. Hamilton had erected ceiling coving when he lived in the flat and had left his DNA on it. 30 years after the atrocity, detectives finally knew who was responsible for it. The answer was a serial killer and his loner misfit brother-in-law. Nothing had happened in the subsequent trial of Sinclair in 2007 altered the police's views who was behind the murders. Instead, when the case collapsed following a motion of no case to answer from Sinclair's counsel, Edgar Praise QC, police voiced astonishment. Sinclair had lodged a special defence of incrimination, blaming his dead brother-in-law for the murders, but 7 years later there was no mistake. Angus Sinclair, a man without compassion or remorse, was the serial killer responsible for 2 of Scotland's most chilling murders. It had taken too long to nail him. Sinclair's retrial for the brutal murders of Christine, Edie and Helen Scott was the first to take place following change in law made in Scotland 3 years ago. The centuries-old double jeopardy principle, which prevented a person being tried twice for the same crime. In 2011, Move paved the way for prosecutors to end Sinclair's 37-year evasion of justice for the killings which shocked Scotland. When Sinclair's first trial for the teenagers' murders collapsed in 2007 at the High Court in Edinburgh, it seemed the victims' relatives would always be denied the justice they had craved for their loved ones. Immediately after the case fell through, Miss Scott's father expressed his belief that Sinclair was involved in his daughter's death and stated, "I am absolutely shattered. Words can't explain how I feel." 30 years of trying to get a conclusion. I promised I would stick by this and get justice, which honestly I don't think I got today. A number of years would pass before hopes of seeing Sinclair once again in the dock for Christine and Helen's murders looked like they could become a reality. Towards the end of 2011, the legislation which aimed to allow the retrial of suspects who may have escaped punishment in the past came into force. The double jeopardy principles which stopped an acquitted suspect being tried again was enshrined in law, but exceptions were not permitted. Under the Double Jeopardy Law in Scotland Act, a suspect could face retrial for a very serious crime if compelling new evidence emerged, if the original trial was tainted, or where a suspect admitted the offence. In Sinclair's case, events moved at a pace. Within months, a new investigation in the World's End murder was launched under the new double jeopardy laws, and prosecutors were soon applying for him to have a retrial. Once granted, the current Lord Advocate, Frank Mulholland QC, decided to personally take charge of prosecuting the case, a sign of how much the Crown wanted the verdict in the landmark trial to go their way. Speaking after Sinclair's conviction and sentencing, Mr. Mulholland said the guilty verdict against Angus Sinclair was one made possible after the Scottish Government modernised our legal system by passing the double jeopardy law. I gave the relatives my personal commitment that the Crown would do everything possible to ensure they received justice. The introduction of the double jeopardy law meant I was able to apply for a retrial of Angus Sinclair as Scotland's first under this legislation. As Lord Advocate, I was considered it was my public duty to personally prosecute such an important case. It was important for the families of Helen and Christine and in the public interest that this case was finally resolved and justice was delivered. Following the amendment of the law of double jeopardy which would have prevented his retrial, Sinclair was retried on October 2014 and convicted of both murders on the 14th of November 2014. Sinclair has been described as Scotland's worst serial killer. He is thought to have killed 4 other women in addition to Edie and Scott, all within a 7-month period. So Angus Sinclair got away with these horrific murders for nearly 40 years. But to me, like I've mentioned at the start of the video, the Scottish justice system has let all of these victims down for the simple fact that any man or any person that kills a child should be on licence for the rest of their life. They should be in prison for the rest of their life, but if they are ever let out, they should be on licence and they should be kept an eye on. There should have been no way Angus Sinclair was able to go on and commit all these horrific offences and murders after he killed an innocent child, 7-year-old, and served only 6 years in prison. But Angus Sinclair died at the age of 73 in 2019, and he spent over 30 years in prison. But Angus Sinclair should have never have been given a second chance after killing the first child, and he should have been kept on probation and kept on reports so that he could never have went on to commit these other murders. But I hope you are all enjoying this content, even though it's a sensitive topic, and my heart goes out to the victims and the victims' families. But at long last, they did eventually get justice in the end, and they could eventually put their loved ones to rest and move on with their lives before their life was over. But Angus Sinclair died in prison at the age of 73, and he was serving the longest sentence ever given out in Scottish history. But I'll leave that one there for now, people. Hopefully you enjoyed the content. And if you did, remember to comment, like and subscribe. And a massive thanks to all my subscribers for your continuing support, and all my Patreon members who are subscribed for exclusive content, what I don't put on YouTube. If you all want to become a member of my Patreon, go down and click the link in the description. Enjoy the rest of your day, people. Take care.